Can you hear me? Yes. Yay. Welcome, everybody. We'll get started. It's a pleasure, a joy to be here today with all of you. My name is Tatiana Fraser, and I will be sharing the Coralus, I say that properly, case study on scaling deep with you. So thank you for joining. I'm really excited to share this learning and insight with you all. And I'll give you some context, and I'm going to walk us through the scaling deep framework, and then share some of the very specific insights that came from talking to the Coralus community. So that's the arc. And what we'll do is, after I do some talking, we'll pause, and if we have enough time, we'll create an opportunity for you to talk together, and then we can have like a discussion in the big group. Okay, that's going to be the plan. And I have a lot of tech happening here, so just you'll have to bear with me in case I'm looking for, the technology. So my name is Tatiana, and I am co-director of what's called the System Sanctuary. So we are an international organization, platform. My partner and co-conspirator is Rachel Sinha from the UK, who was the founder of the Finance Innovation Lab over a decade ago. And what we do is we teach systems change, practice, and leadership to leaders internationally. And we also facilitate peer learning and sense-making and strategy development for systems change at an ecosystem level. And we do that internationally. And we've been working together for about 6 years. So that's sort of my background. I come to this from a systems change practice. Before that, I co-founded an organization that's called Girls Action Foundation. So I grew up and cut my teeth on intersectional feminist systems change work. But I was very fortunate to study with thought leaders around systems change in the early days of that work, Brenda Zimmerman and Frances Wesley, who are Canadian. And I was introduced to complexity theory through their teaching, and that informed how we scaled our work at Girls Action. And so my work over the last decade has been bridging and weaving across intersectional feminist change work and systems change work. So that's a little bit about me and where I'm coming from, and a little bit about why we're here. I also, when I left Girls Action and I stepped down over a decade ago, I was obsessed with systems change, and I was obsessed with scaling deep. And the reason is, as I was journeying through this sort of collective learning about how are we doing social innovation and how are we changing systems, I was really lucky to be in an inquiry that was led by Frances Wesley at the time. And she was talking about scaling as pathways to systems change. And so this is where we see this framing around scaling up and scaling out. And so she was coming up with these pathways to scaling up and scaling out. And she asked all the participants, these are the 5 pathways. Can you go sit at a table where you feel like you fit into one of these pathways? And they were great pathways. But I couldn't go to the table because I was like, there's something missing. It doesn't quite work. And the work that we were doing at Girls Action was very much about scaling deep. And so I went to the other table because there was the other table for the people who didn't fit. And that started, this conversation is about what about scaling deep when we're doing systems change. And so this has been an inquiry I've been holding for the last decade. And I was really fortunate to have, after doing work around this, investment or a commission from Ashoka Global, Ashoka Canada, to do research around leaders who are scaling deep. Because while this framing is in the zeitgeist, it's out in the water, we didn't fully understand what is scaling deep as a practice, as a strategy. And what I noticed over many years of this kind of following this thread is that people who are often scaling deep were women who were leading, and they couldn't get supported for the work. It was hard for them to get funding. Often also equity seeking or more marginalized communities that were leading in this way. And so that was frustrating for me. And often they were getting kind of dismissed and written off because the work that happens at the deep level was being pointed to as abstract, too abstract, you can't point to it, it's not concrete, therefore we can't fund it. And that was kind of the mantra over and over again. And so I thought, enough of that, I've seen this enough. It's tangible, you can see it, it's actually something. So let's go deep in our understanding. And so just for the framing, scaling up is working at the institutional level. Scaling out is when you're spreading a proven concept. So it's like franchise, or blowing a dandelion and seeding ideas. When I say up, working at the institutional level, that's where often we point to around systemic change. That's where policy change happens, rules, regulations. And what happened then is we started to understand scaling deep as the cultural work and change and the inner transformational change. But that was it. That's all that we kind of got to. So we did this inquiry, and I'm going to share with you what we discovered. And then Vicky said, we're scaling deep. Could you do a case study for us about how we're doing that? And of course, I was over the moon and thrilled. And so I spent a couple of months speaking to ventures, activators from the community, the team, gathering stories and sense making around the practices of Coralus. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. And then we'll jump into a discussion about it. Okay, that's the plan. I really wanted to understand. So yeah, I'm going to run through just to give you a taste and framing of what we found. Again, we were looking at how is scaling deep actually contributing to change and deep transformational change, and what is the practice? What's the impact that it's having? One thing just to note when we did this is scaling deep is in the zeitgeist. Like, we are in a moment of meta crisis, poly crisis, right? And there's this calling to go deeper. There's this calling into, okay, wait a second, this isn't working. How do we do this differently? And so while that's true, so there's this sense of timeliness, right, and importance, we also know that this work has been traditionally undervalued and under-resourced, as I mentioned. And there was a lack of really understanding the language, the practice, and a lack of shared language to point to it and talk about it. So what is scaling deep? These are the things we found. It's the personal transformation and healing work. I'm going to come over here so I can actually read off my slides here for a moment. It's where change happens. So it's how we are in relationship to change. It's how culture is shaping us, and then it's how we are influencing change. It's going to the root of the problem. So it's getting down into the systemic causes, the root systems. It's changing incentives and conversation and how things are done. And then it's also challenging dominant thinking in academia, in business, and even in the change sector around how change happens. So this is the work of scaling deep. It nurtures the foundations for change and enables collaboration. So it creates the conditions for that. It's a continual process of reflection and action, renewal and interconnection. It requires slowing down and deepening, which is countercultural in this moment of go, 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 and urgency. And it's the work that can inform action on other levels. So it's not to say that scaling up and scaling out is wrong or bad, and we don't want to say this is better and that's not good. But when you're scaling deep, it actually informs more powerful interventions at other levels. So what does it look like? So we came up with about 7 or 8 buckets of practices and strategies. So creating the conditions for healing, and this looks like strength-based approaches, reflective practice, the actual healing work, starting where people are at. So challenging kind of ideas of problem and pathology, and actually rooting in where people are experiencing their lives and the systems, and moving from that place. It's empathy, perspective taking, it's heart-centered work, spirit-centered work, and it's also practicing different ways of knowing. And so you'll probably hear this resonance of like, how do we see this work happening in your world, and also in the Coralus work as well. It's connection-based practices. So this is bringing a holistic and interconnected lens. So moving away from kind of outdated operating systems of mechanistic control and command. You know, everything's separated. You can fix a part and it'll change everything. It's grounded in history and context was critical. Like, this work is rooted in context. It's not something we lift up and roll out and spread. It's also the practice of working across difference and actually having the capacity to do that. It's centering lived experience, and it's working at repair and collective healing. So connection-based practices were key. Shifting power was very important. And this is one of my like really important pieces, where a lot of times in systems change, we talk about relationships are everything. So when you're moving into interconnectivity, relationships, it's about the in-between, and that's really key and important, but not at the expense of also keeping a power lens present. And often in the system spaces, that's missing. And so we can hold both together. It's important to be bringing and working with an analysis of power. It's also then discovering new sites of power, because we're recognizing agency in spaces and places, and we're relating to that differently. And it's also includes empowerment processes as well. And then we move to collective learning. So there's many ways to practice this, and there's lots of lineages and roots into what is collective learning. Experiential learning, embodiment, land-based practices, popular education, reflexivity, training, knowledge exchange. So, you know, we can come into collective learning in many, many different ways, but this was really important, working with emergence and in emergence. So having the capacity to be adapting, flexible, iterating, working in non-linear ways was really important, and multi-dimensional ways, learning from history and taking the long view, which is counter again to this like short-term silver bullet, quick fixing, which seems to be, you know, what we see a lot of. And then we saw a lot of shifting narrative. So this is again working in culture, recentering. So what stories are we hearing, lifting up, celebrating? So recentering from dominant narratives and assumptions around stories to you know, multiple diverse ways of seeing and expressing those stories, which is building new narratives. This is a big piece. And then finally, shifting patterns and fundamental reframes, which I think Coralus does amazingly well at. This is new habits, new rituals, changing the way people lead, organize, manage, working from hierarchies to networks, interconnected, distributed leadership, and then redefining success, challenging the assumptions around success, which we again saw a lot of. So next, I just want to talk a little bit about like why the resistance, because there is resistance. This is challenging kind of dominant ways of doing and being in the world. And ultimately, you know, when we look at the Western paradigms and values that are celebrated, which is endless growth, which is progress, which is success that looks a certain way, these paradigms inform the ways in which the world is operating. So this is challenging the operating system and really trying to bring in a new one. And we see in that funding constraints that are based and rooted in this paradigm, and traditional ways of measuring and thinking about success. So in funding, you know, we're still looking for metrics. We're still looking for numbers, big is better, growth, high impact. And that's, you know, that isn't, when you're scaling deep, that's not necessarily how to measure success. And then underneath this is unconscious frames and bias, and then hesitation and fear for actually supporting the work. So now we get into what is the promise and potential in scaling deep. And what we saw is that the highest potential is that this is the deep, transformative, durable, long-term change that we're seeking, right? That we're trying to create in the world, and specifically for systems change. It's work that emerges and comes to new sites of power. So not only are we redefining and challenging power systems, but we're actually discovering new sites of power. It supports cultures and ethics of care and love. And we heard that a lot this morning, care, the cultures of care that we're trying to create together. Intergenerational and relational level change. In this, we see cascading impacts. And it's work that is upstream and preventative as well. It's disrupting harmful patterns. It leads to equity and trust. So equity is kind of baked into this approach. And it has the potential to change cultural landscapes and support healthy systems. So in this work, we're kind of aligning with health, we're aligning with life, we're aligning with care. And that's part of the transformation. So that's a lot. That's my walkthrough of all the practices, strategies, and potential in this work. And I'm hoping you'll feel the resonance of this for the work that Coralus is doing. And you can like focus your lens to actually see the work through this. So after speaking with about, I think like 15 to 20, we did 20 plus interviews. We did some analysis and looked for patterns. And it was what came through, and this is what I want to share with you, is this sort of journey, this mapping of the journey that Coralus, not just the ventures, but the activators and folks in the community all kind of walked through. And so we designed it in a spiral because I think this is a cyclical, there isn't quite a beginning or an end, but we did see the patterns of starting with this initial discontent and questioning. Like there is, whether it's a wound, like a trauma that one is walking through that finally calls, okay, enough already. If I'm going to heal myself, I'm manifesting that and I'm creating with it. And we see that in a lot of the products, right? So the idea of there's no medication to heal my mother. And so I'm a scientist and I'm going to go create it. This is one of the ventures. But this is a seed. But it's also people who've been in dominant systems. So a lot of people we spoke to who were also, say, for example, in the accounting system or finance systems, these very male-dominated, very patriarchal, capitalist, colonial systems where they just can't survive anymore, right? Where they're suffocating and it's like, fuck this. I'm going out of the system and I'm starting something new. I'm going to do this differently. So this very, very poignant moment of this isn't working. So we're confronting challenges in the dominant systems, the dominant culture, and knowing that there's something wrong with the system. It's kind of the first step. Then there's this discovery and connection with community, with Coralus, and people coming in. So we just heard over and over again, even I felt it, sitting with people. I was like, oh my God, I found my tribe again. Like I feel so alone in this work. I'm up against challenges. It's hard. And then you meet someone who understands, who gets it, who resonates with your story. So that connection to community, to people who understand, and then the relational kind of magic happens, and the exchanging and the learning and the storytelling and the relating. This is kind of a key next step. Really, there's an experiential connection, I think, in the community that we saw. And so next is this then idea of experimentation, embracing uncertainty, and collective learning through that. So this kind of posture that we also see in the Scaling Deep, which is we don't have this all figured out. We don't have all the answers. There's a shift and there's a humility in that, I think, but a willingness to say, okay, this is going to emerge. And I think this is reflective of where Coralus is at right now in emerging the new world, in emerging. And so many of the ventures that would, be pivoting based on information and then taking steps forward around what they're learning and what they're seeing. So that's an interesting kind of individual posture, but also a collective one as well. And then the redefining success and power. So we heard this over and over again, people coming in and say, okay, what does success look like? There is a code for success, right? Like we talked about, there's like the investment, more money, more growth, someone buys. And Vicky spoke to the fact that oftentimes people will be walking down this path, working. And then all of a sudden they're in relationships to something they don't understand, and really hard stuff happens, right? And so we also heard that story over and over again. So this also, I think in the sense of community, this collective understanding that this system isn't working. And so we have this other way of thinking about success and thinking about power. So when we look at reframes and repatterning, power and success were kind of key for the community. And in that, there's this sense of empowerment with becoming very connected to what's my gift and how can I bring that to the world? What's my purpose? What is the deepest information that is guiding me? And so that was a step. And then co-creating a new culture of care and generosity. And so that is clearly in the radical generosity. We saw that that's the invitation into Coralus. But it just rippled out over and over again from all of the stories, whether they were about ventures connecting activators, or even, I think, in the ventures themselves, the individual creation of the ventures. And what happens then is we have this beautiful expansion that happens, impact. And I would love, I think would really love to be able to kind of map the multiple levels. So in systems change, we're thinking about multiple levels of intervention and impact, because we're not acting only on one point. And often when you're talking with entrepreneurs, it's like there is a one-pointed strategy, product that is innovative, and kind of that acts in one point of the system. But in so many ways, there were impacts at multiple levels. And to me, what that is an expansion of the change. And that's part of the power, I think, of transformation. And that then comes into this inner circle of actual transformation. This is the change. This is what's happening, this constant dance of transformation on an inner level, but connected to a collective level through the Coralus community. And so this is deep, personal, spiritual learning and expansion of what is possible. And so that's the journey that we mapped out, which is really cool, I think. And I think what I'll do, I'm just going to check in on time. 35. Okay. I'd like to have some time for discussion, but I will just share with you some of the quotes that came out. So a little more substance to some of the stories that we heard. So in the context of healing, creating the conditions for healing. So this is a quote: "I entered startup land and they loved me because I was prepared to put my life on the line. When I look back on it now, I'm like, there was so much harm happening to me." So that moment of waking. It's all about the heart, asking, who are you and how can I help? Rather than, who are you and what do you do? We are driven by spirit and affirm life in all its forms. So that's a little bit about the individual kind of catalyst. And then the community building, the connections practices. This sense of belonging has deepened my understanding of my place within a lineage of transformative individuals and systems, both from past generations and for those to come. It has rooted a profound sense of identity and purpose in me, providing the confidence, energy, and encouragement needed to take the next steps in my journey. And another Coralus for me marked my first real encounter with a community of women where help is given freely, with no strings attached. It's a different kind of space, one where I feel a deep sense of trust in people's intentions and they understand. It instilled in me a conviction that change is possible and that the approach to finding solutions lies within us, encouraging introspection over external searches. It was really cool stuff, really beautiful. Yeah, I'll just read a few more. Surrounding oneself, this also speaks to the collective learning, surrounding oneself with the right people, those who share a similar worldview and offer support, not by fixing individuals, but by aiming to transform the system, seems crucial. This community can act as a bulwark against internalized misogyny, which I see as one of the most significant barriers to progress. Yeah. Okay, so around emergence, I began to approach leadership with an openness about not having all the answers, admitting to my team, I don't know how we're going to do this, but I am certain we won't continue as we have. This was the first step in our collective journey towards developing new collaborative methods, inviting everyone to share their thoughts, and fundamentally changing my approach to leadership. And working with the possibility. How do we transition from a mindset of impossibility and scarcity to one of wonder, curiosity, and awe? What if I challenge my own mental constructs and the beliefs that hold me back, allowing myself just 15 minutes to truly believe in the potential of what could be? Imagine the possibilities that could emerge from granting myself this temporary permission to believe. Could this openness forge a new path, a new sense of awareness, akin to proprioception, but on a different, more profound level? It's about tapping into that something, that essence or juice, by simply allowing yourself to believe, even if just momentarily. Yeah. All right. So there's just one more I'm going to read, and then I'm going to open it up. Okay, so this is really cool. And I think this is inspiring for where Coralus is moving to and the power and potential. It highlights that transformation can occur in small, potent clusters, critical yeast, each contributing unique elements to the broader ecosystem. Coralus, in my view, embodies this critical yeast with numerous microcosms within it acting as agents of change. These clusters are alive with the very transformation we aim to realize on a larger scale. This realization reinforces my belief in scaling deep, understanding that comprehensive societal change doesn't need to engage everyone simultaneously, but can be effectively driven by living examples of the desired future, resonating and inspiring the broader shifts. Yeah, isn't that really beautiful stuff? So it's the case study is about 30 pages long, and we're going to share it. So there's a little more to integrate, and kind of we'll make it pretty, and then you'll be able to see it. And what we hear when we share the scaling deep work, and just to say, the original research was interviewing about 25 leaders internationally as well. So there's a lot that there's a lot that's been gathered to make sense of this practice. Anyways, we'll be sharing the Coralus case study, but I think one of the things that's so important is it gives a framework and language for ways people are working intuitively to be able to strengthen that and share with others, which is makes, yeah, satisfying. So just to wrap up, this is kind of my also read on the gold that comes through scaling deep and the potential. Scaling deep creates the conditions for change. So we're rooted in the root systems. When we're doing this work, we're creating, we're nurturing, we're working at the soil level, the root level, and then, you know, we do work up into the trees and into the air, and but it creates the conditions for change. It's also embodied change. So that's one thing we noticed. It's actually embodying the change, being it. We are it when we are in a scaling deep work. It shifts power, and I don't want to underestimate this. This is really important, and the through lines of the meta systems of inequity, that being patriarchal, capitalist, colonialist, racist meta systems that run through all of them, is we're working at that level of shifting power. Scaling deep informs wise action across scale. So wisdom to inform how do we scale up? How do we scale out when we take those moves? This one is kind of cool. Scaling deep directly connects to narrative. So this is a multiple level in framework when you're doing systems change. And I'm not going to walk us through all of this. It's fun. I really like this. But what we do notice is that at the landscape level, that's the level of narrative. That's the level of what are the stories that we tell. And oftentimes in systems change, people who think they want to influence landscape, they think they have to be heavy power. Like they think you need a lot of money and a lot of weight and you need a lot of media. But the truth is the work at the deep root systems connects to landscape in a really powerful way. And so people who think linear, we're going to hit the regime and then we're going to go to landscape, there's another way to get there. And that challenges a lot of the linear assumptions about how we're doing systems change work. Scaling deep cuts across division. And this is really important in the polarization and the divisive world that we live in that is increasingly fragmented. When we're working at that deep level, we are emerging a third pathway forward. We are in the work of bringing in other context to get to complexity, to create other opportunities and moving beyond polarization. And I think that practice is really important. Scaling deep challenges systems of inequity. As I mentioned, it's critical, this work, at the inner internalized level and also at the structural level. It expands beyond institutional change. And this is my favorite. I don't know about you, but I've been in the change work for a really, really long time. And I feel sometimes like it's so restricting and restricted. But when you're in the deep, there's expansion. There's so much more room. And we're moving beyond organizations and mandates and those sorts of limitations. And that's it. There you go. That's thank you. Thank you. All right. So thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to share this with you. And we have about 10 minutes. So what I'll invite you to do is just take a moment to reflect for yourself on like maybe what resonated, what questions emerged for you. Do you see yourself mirrored back in this work? And then we can have a discussion. But let's just take a minute to reflect for yourself, kind of anchor this in your own experience. And I invite people on Zoom to do the same. Just take a moment, if you have a paper, pen, and just jot down your reflections. Okay, so thank you for just taking that pause and breath. And if we had more time, I'd break us out to kind of jam a little bit together, which is really nice to do. But let's, because we have about 10 minutes. I'd love to hear questions or reflections, insights that you have for yourself. Yeah. I'll start here and then we'll come over. Yeah. Thanks. Oh, 1 second. I'm going to hand this around. We have Zoom.
Thanks for this and your deep professional knowledge in this whole change, big picture stuff. This resonates tremendously with the work in my experience. This model appears that it can use in any kind of system arena because, for example, I work in the corporate space and it relates directly, you can map it directly on the structure and the, all of that stuff. So yeah, what are we doing differently here than we would in other spaces? I guess what's one of the questions.
Thanks. And by differently, do you mean with Coralus? Yeah. From my experience working in different spaces around systems and scaling deep, I think what I see is that entrepreneurship is, in my read, it's a creative process. It's kind of a manifesting and creating. And I don't think we think about it like that very often. It's kind of business, right? And I think it's important to note that the scaling up and out is business framing, right? So when we think about the paradigms that it's coming from. And so what we see in Coralus is all this beautiful creativity that is saying, this doesn't work. This isn't working. And I want to create this, so there's a creativity that's coming through entrepreneurship. And if you look, one thing that I think is interesting is that when you use this framework, and I don't have time, but I'd love to offer it. I can share different ways we can share this with you, but entrepreneurship is at the level of niches of innovation. So it's where the new ideas come. And so Coralus is supporting the niches of innovation. And so when you look at the dynamics, how does that then shift systems? There are ways to analyze the interconnected work to shift systems, which is a whole other thing. But the community building and support is at that niches of innovation, but it's innovation that is challenging the system, right? And so the community then is supported to keep going because there's a resonance and an understanding of what we're doing around innovation, which then will and is leading to systems change. So I think what's unique about that is it's supporting women identified, non-binary folks who are creating from a very powerful place and aligning that integrity to bring something new into the world and then to connect it so it's powerful, critical yeast. Yeah. Thanks. Over here, there's some questions, and I think you guys had. Shall we start? Did you want to start and then?
It's more of a comment, and the comment is this: that as I was reflecting on what you've just said, which is awesome, because we're talking about systems change, and we're talking about, in essence, it's group change, and but I actually saw it as individual change, because I was thinking, well, what can we do? What can I do? And what's interesting is I was looking at requiring slowing down and creating conditions for healing within ourselves. So what happens with that, if we follow this regime ourselves, then it's how we behave to others. And that, once we start changing how we behave with others, that then they start changing as well, because then their reaction back is a little different. And that kind of permeates through. So it was just a reflection I had.
Yeah. That's great. I'll just add, there is something I think because part of the old paradigm is individualistic framing, which is kind of neoliberal capitalist, right? Individuals. The stance between, and the other thing I just want to say is systems change is also creating new systems. Like, it's not tinkering with the old system necessarily. I think Coralus is more outside, trying to create something new. But there's this dance between we heal the self to heal the system. We heal the self. But when we bring that work to collective levels, there's intention in that. It's kind of held differently. It's like, but it's connecting. It is like you're speaking to the in-between and the connection. And then I think the question is, what else can be done? I think that's what Coralus is asking. How can we bring this to a collective level to hold that individual? You can't do it. We have to do the individual work. It won't work otherwise. Yeah. Thanks.
I was going to ask a question, but I'll quickly add to that, that a couple of months ago, I was talking to a philanthropist investor who's the only VC that I've ever met that invests in Indigenous peoples. And I was telling him about my vision, which is super similar to what we just heard in the room with Vicky, which is wild and interesting. And he said, he's like, it sounds like you've done a lot of healing. And it's interesting because the vision is obviously it's to empower the citizenry of the world to own and participate in the value financially, community-wise, et cetera, in that change. And I think it's really interesting. But the question I actually had was around this slide, interestingly enough. And what you had mentioned was a lot of times the systems change people. We think in terms of we had more money and we had like all of that. I'm like, I totally resonate. It's like to create the culture change. And you kind of left us with, well, if you want more information. So I'd love to know how we can get this more information. So I'm very, very curious about that. Thanks.
So we teach these frameworks. And so it's the system sanctuary. And if you go on our site, you can access how we do that, whether it's training and also some resources. And I'm happy to follow up also. Yeah. Okay. Great. Here, and then-
Thank you. This is, I'm going to say, deeply moving. And I wanted to bring in the spiritual aspect. It's my experience of it, of listening to you. It's incredibly validating of something I've been experiencing for myself as personally, but also as a coach for other women. And it's this, we don't need to transcend ourselves in order to transform. We need to go deeper. We need to descend into our bodies, into the roots, and then we can rise from there and into the heart. Yeah. And that's just thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Thank you. That connection. So we're here and then over here. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. In the spiral, I think the part that caught me was redefining success and power. And over the last number of years, I've had countless forest walks with friends where we feel like we're not successful. And I think it's just this feeling that we're trying, like there's so much impact it's having, but it's at this small scale. And we have this idea that we have to change the world. And there's so much, I can't even see beyond that because I just get stuck at that one. And I'm sitting with that and it's heavy, but I came today thinking I'm not successful. And then it's having to redefine what that success looks like. And it's just a real beautiful place to be in, to see that on there. And then also to realize that I'm stuck in that part and I need to kind of lean in a little.
Thank you for sharing that. It's not easy to do it. And I think there's a lot of power in the community that mirrors back the different ways that can happen. When someone says, like, fuck it, I'm not doing this anymore. It's hurting me, right? It's too hard. And to then, the measures of success in our society are so dominant, right? And then, I think when you bring a gender lens to that and you ask, what does that mean for women? It's a big question. And there's a lot of like sense making to do across different stages of life. We hear burnout over like so much burnout and bodies that are saying no, it's really, it's something. And I personally really relate to it. I think when I stepped away from Girls Action, I had a vision of like on my deathbed where I was like, my coach asked me, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? What are you going to do? What's the big next thing? And I imagined myself at the end of my life and all that mattered was love. That's it. It didn't matter what I accomplished, what awards, what success, not at all. It was like, it mattered, the love. And that's when I feel like, oh my God, what the hell am I doing? What am I doing? What am I doing? I just had to come back to it's love and expanding and growing that. So there we go. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, over here. Yeah.
Thank you. I found this to be a really helpful explanatory framework. And in particular, it helped me to make sense of a creative project that I was involved in, that I was involved in some years ago, which is very much this. I knew that it had a deeply transformative impact on the people who directly participated, and it was very powerful in creating narrative change for the people who consumed it. And I was interested in scaling it out, but I was not successful in doing that. I think partly because of my own limitations as a fundraiser, but also because of things you talked about in this presentation, which is that this kind of work isn't really fully understood or valued by funders. And so I was curious to know if you had any thoughts on how we could make scaling deep work, how we could, unfortunately, we have to sell the value of it to funders. So how do we do that? Particularly in a philanthropic sense, I think, more than an investment one.
That's a great question, and it's definitely preoccupies my. Just going to check the time. I think we have like maybe 2 more minutes, and then we'll have to wrap it up. And thank you. Yes. So one of the things we're doing now is like doing case studies like this, we can illustrate what is the impact and what are the stories and what does it actually look like, and then share that with the world. And we're doing more of that work. I'm really interested in also being able to see what is the change, and because when we look at the highest potential, it's like it's there. There's actual stuff we can say is happening. It's not all abstract. And so I think there's a conversation that needs to happen there, and a centering and shining light and celebrating this work, and I think this community is a great example of what happens when there's a center of gravity that can speak this and claim it and own it. And so we just need to be doing more of it. And then the other thing I think that's interesting is that there is this also like new sites of power question is a bit of turning away from the dominant system and also just saying like, I don't need your validation. I don't need you to get it. I don't need you going over here. And that's what I think is really beautiful about this community is like, we're over here and we're doing our thing. And it's almost like you need to let go of that gaze and that relationship to really honor, and center what's possible. I think that's one of the things.
Thank you. Extremely interesting. So my name is Brenda Dragon, and I'm a manifestor, a creator, and I just want to speak to innovation. So I think sometimes we think innovation has to be new ideas, and I think sometimes innovation is actually looking to the past and bringing it forward in a new way. And traditions are not returning to the past, but perhaps more about valuing the wisdom in the past and bringing it forward in a new way.
Yes, and yes, that's beautiful and absolutely important to recognize, and also to recognize as a healing process of becoming whole and coming to that wisdom and knowing that has been cut off. Yeah.
I just on the redefining success and power piece, I work with middle income women and I see money, and Bank of America Merrill Lynch said that actually ran the statistics of how much less we earn over the course of our lives, and it's over $1 million less for they only do it on a binary men women over the course of our careers. So it's really hard for us, any of us, to achieve the success that we've seen out there when we are so statistically disadvantaged. So I just wanted to give that to everyone, that it is way harder for us as women to be successful, and it's not your fault, right? Like that's a statistical thing. It doesn't mean we can't blow that out of the water, and I don't want that to be a limitation, but I just want you to understand that it's systematic and it has nothing to do with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So this will be our last comment, and then we'll close.
And absolutely. And it's a measure of success. Like it's going back to that dominant paradigm of that is one measure, but we in the previous session sort of heard about like capital, like redefining our capital. And when you ask people to look beyond their financial capital to contribute to change, it's amazing when they're invited how much they can bring. So yes, It's like, yes, and like, don't, don't minimize how much that impacts us. And there's so much, but thank you.
It's, I think this is a shift also, we hear it echoed from the scarcity mindset, which is of the operating system, to abundance. And what does that look like? So thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to the Zoom participants. And we'll have something to share with you. And if you're interested in learning more, don't hesitate to reach out from this to the System Sanctuary. My contacts will be available. Thank you. Thank you. Montreal. I'm in Montreal. Yeah. Thanks.